So we begin a new module today, ecology. Begs the question, what is ecology? Well, if you look at the screen there, you can see what the definition is. It's the study of how living organisms relate to their environment. So this lizard here is a living organism, and it is superbly adapted to its environment, even though it's sticking out very much for a predator maybe to come and eat it. But everything that it relates to, including predators, competitors, rocks, air, right, are all part of its environment. And it essentially relates to all of that, interacts with it. And that's what ecology is. Ecology can be very specific, like we could look at the ecology of this species and its life history characteristics. That's what we call autecology, which is the first thing we're going to work on today. And then you can also look at populations, which are members of this critter species that it relates to. And then you can expand that further into communities, which are all of the living organisms of all species that it might relate to, including its predators, its prey, its competitors. And then we can expand it even further to the ecosystem, which includes everything in an area, both living and non-living, i.e. both biotic and abiotic, which is non-living. And then finally, we can look at large areas of the earth that consist of the same ecosystem. For example, if you are here at Ferrum, or if you were here at Ferrum, you would be part of the temperate deciduous forest biome, which is a large area that includes everything from the eastern United States, eastern Canada, parts of Asia and Europe. That's a biome. So let's start out with, at the species level, looking at autecology, which is a study of the life history and the characteristics of that life history of individual species. For example, this is a great egret. Why is it called a great egret? Because it's great. Well, it's the biggest of 3 egrets that we have here in North America, the tallest. What about the ecology of the species? Well, it is a wetland bird. It lives close to water. It's got a long beak. What does it feed on with that long beak? Fish and crustaceans. It's got long legs for wading out to find those fish. Got a long neck for extending into the water to spear those fish. What else about it? What eats it? Well, if it's not careful, it could get eaten by an alligator or a bald eagle, a big raptor from above. All right. Or any number of land predators that are able to take it. Where does it nest? Well, it's a colonial nester. It nests up in tops of trees where predators can't get it so easily. Colonial means it nests with other birds that have similar nests nearby, called rookeries. And it nests once a year, and it lays, can't remember, 2 or 3 eggs. It cares for them for a while by incubating them, and then it feeds them for a while, and then they go off. Everything about a species and what it does with its biotic and abiotic environment is life history characteristics. So we can talk about reproduction, parental care, R and K selection, which might not be familiar if you have not taken ecology before or biology. But R species are ones that typically grow fast, reproduce a lot of individuals, and die young. K species are species that grow very slowly, get to be a large size, and then they reproduce a few offspring with often a lot of parental care and live very long, okay? We'll get into that. You can look at what habitat selection is. Like this bird selects habitat near water. That's where it feeds. What does it feed on? Fish. And then how does it take care of itself in terms of ecological balance, biological balance within the organism? Does it maintain a steady temperature? Yes. It is a endotherm, meaning that it maintains or it's able to generate body heat, which makes it typically a homeotherm, maintaining a steady body temperature. How does it maintain its water balance? Okay, how does it maintain everything within its body at a balanced state? That's what we call homeostasis. So let's look at reproductive systems. In animals, you typically have separate male and female individuals. And in order to make offspring, they mate through sexual reproduction. Hermaphrodites are organisms, species that have both male and female parts. And in animals, they still undergo sexual reproduction, typically, not always. In plants, you have dioece, where you have male and female reproductive structures on separate plants, i.e. you have male plants and female plants. That's rare. Most plants have both male and female reproductive structures on the same plant. That makes them hermaphrodites, essentially. But there's two different types of hermaphrodites. We'll see that in a second. Plants can also reproduce asexually, i.e. they can make clones of themselves. And a good example of that are strawberry plants. They can run across the ground with what we call runners. Remember those? Plant a root system. If that runner gets disconnected, that plant can still live, that new plant. That's asexual reproduction. Interestingly, some animals and plants can actually change sexes over time. For example, this plant here called the jack in the pulpit. Sometimes it's a male, sometimes it's female. It's a perennial plant. It comes up every year, but sometimes it has only a male reproductive structure. Sometimes it has a female reproductive structure. Animals too can do that. Fish can start out, some fish, not all, start out as males and then turn into females over time as they get larger and are able to have more body space for eggs. It's called sequential hermaphroditism. So an example of hermaphroditic plants, you can have a plant that is a true hermaphrodite, which has an ovary, female part, and stamen, male part, which produces pollen. Or you could have a monoecious hermaphrodite, which has male flowers and female flowers, but on the same plant. Dioecious plants are either female or male, depending on what type of flower they have. What about mating systems when looking at animals? Monogamy is a behavioral mating system in animals where you have pairing of male and individual male and females, either for a season or sometimes for life. Like some of the large raptors, they mate for life. You can also have polygamy, which means that you have either one male mating with many females or vice versa. If you have one male mating with many females, that's called polygyny. Here, many gametes, many females. Okay, break down the words, break down the different parts of the word, and you can come up with many females. So a good example is our white-tailed deer here in the eastern United States. A male deer will typically mate with many females. You can also have the opposite, many males. This is rare, but it occurs in some species like sandpipers, where you have a female sandpiper that mates with lots of males. And the female lays eggs from one male, gets the male to take care of the eggs and goes off and mates with another male, lays another clutch of eggs, gets the male to take care of it. Then you have promiscuity, which is just random mating. Okay, so many carnivorous animals, rather than the order Carnivora, are like this. Bobcats. Male mates with a female that it encounters. If the female is an estrus, receptive to mating, they mate. And then the female goes off, has her kits, and the male goes off. Maybe finds another mate. Maybe or maybe not. But it's just chance encounter. Box turtles, common terrestrial turtle. Male and female, like, hey, bump into each other. If the female is receptive and the male is receptive, they mate. And then they split. Mate and split. So let's look at these a little closer. Monogamy. They're pretty rare in mammals. Why? Well, in mammals, the female is got what the young need. Milk. Male doesn't have milk. So in many mammals, the male and female mate, and then that's it. It's either promiscuity or in some cases, polygyny. The male goes off and mates with another female. In birds, though, the male has something to do, i.e., it can help incubate the eggs. It can help find food for the young, because birds don't have mammary glands or in females, right, in milk. So there's a fitness reward. A fitness reward means that the young have a better chance of survival and passing the genes along of the male and the female if the male hangs around and helps. That doesn't mean that there's not cheating. Okay, so here's a male bluebird and there's a female bluebird, and they hang together and they make a nest, they mate and then have a nest. And maybe either of these goes off and finds another, like, oh, going to have an affair. Okay. They're still monogamous, really, but they bend the rules a little bit. So in polygyny, males mate with many females. Pretty common in mammals. Also occurs in some upland game birds like turkeys and grouse and pheasants, where you have one male mating with many females. And you can see what's going on here, right? You got one male elk, and it's got a harem of females. That's called polygyny. Polyandry now, one female mates with more than one male. It's rarer because typically the female has the brunt of the reproductive effort, i.e., it's the one that has young, it's the one that has a litter of babies or a clutch of eggs. But in some cases, if the female can get the male to incubate eggs, the female will go run off and have another clutch. What about hermaphrodism? Hermaphroditism. It's very common in plants, rare in animals. Often you don't have self-fertilization, i.e., the individual that has both male and female reproductive parts does not fertilize itself. It wants to spread its genes. And that doesn't help if it's just making a clone of itself. So it typically, hermaphrodites will exchange genes with another individual and swap sperm and eggs, which is going on here with these earthworms and what we call simultaneous hermaphroditism. The earthworms have reproductive structures called a clitellum, two of them. And what they do is they fertilize each other. So this earthworm is depositing sperm in the clitellum of this one, and this one is providing sperm into the eggs of this clitellum. What about reproductive effort? That includes parental care. Parents will provide food, defense, heat, keep them warm, incubation, sanitation, clean the nest and birds, and sometimes guidance. They'll teach the young how to find food, for example. In birds, you have a high level of parental care because you have a whole period of incubation and feeding young birds before they're able to fly out of the nest. Mammals too, because in most mammals you have a period where the young need to feed from the mammary glands of the mother. These are called altricial young. They need a lot of reproductive effort, a long period of care. In fish, herpetofauna, which are reptiles and amphibians, and invertebrates, young are often precocial. Eggs are laid, the parents split, and the young fend for themselves. Almost no parental care. Not always the case, because you have, in some cases, like in this frog, the male will carry eggs on the back for a while to guard them. In plants, you have differences too in how much energy is expended in reproduction and differences in survival over time. Semiparous species like the century plant have only one reproductive event in their entire lifetime. Century plants live for 100 years, all of a sudden have flowers, reproduce, and die. Heteroparous species reproduce repeatedly, even though there might be a delay in sexual maturity. For example, oak trees can produce acorns typically on a cycle of about 3 or 4 years. It takes them 20 years, though, to get to the point where they can make acorns. Heteroparous, iteration, repetition, repeating. Here in Franklin County, where Ferrum is, and surrounding counties, we just this last summer had a visit from a simiparous species called the periodic cicada. The periodical cicada reproduces every 17 years. When the adults emerge, the adults all die after laying eggs, and it takes the eggs and the larvae 17 years to get to produce a new brood of adults. So I mentioned K and R selection before. K strategist, and K comes from the end of the growth curve of a typical organism where you hit carrying capacity, spelled with a C, not a K. I never got that. But K strategists typically are superior competitors. They specialize in a certain habitat. They live a long time. They develop slowly, but they can reach a large size. It often takes them many years to get to sexual maturity. Our strategists, on the other hand, are disturbance adapted. They don't live very long, but they develop rapidly. They don't get very big, but they have high reproductive rates. What are some examples? K strategists, superior competitor specialists. For an animal, how about a black bear? You have here in the eastern United States. It's a pretty good competitor with other species. It's a lot of food. I wouldn't call it a specialist, but it needs mature forest. It lives a long time, a couple decades or more. Develops slowly, takes 3, 4, 5 years to get to being adult size. Females don't give birth until they're 5 years old or more, and they get big. How about a plant that's a K strategist? How about an oak tree? Pretty good competitor, especially for water on top of ridges. It needs to be in a certain environment, right, where oaks can exist, right? Temperature, precipitation. Lives a long time, 300 years. Develops slowly. It takes 20 years sometimes to develop acorns, and it can get big. How about an R strategist, an animal? How about a white-footed mouse? White-footed mice can live just about anywhere. Okay, they can, forests can burn down, you can still have white-footed mice. They don't live very long, a year or two. They're the base of the food chain to get eaten. They develop quickly. A female white-footed mouse can start having young 3 months. They're small, they're a mouse, and they reproduce a lot. A female mouse that's born today, within a year, can have as many as 30 young within that year. How about a plant? Our friend the dandelion. Dandelions can go anywhere. They can grow in lawns, in roadsides, inside a forest sometimes. They don't live very long. They're biennial, they're 2 years old. They Well, I think they're perennial, actually. Need to remember that. They develop rapidly. They're small and they reproduce. Well, those little white little things on the dandelion head, whoosh, seeds, lots of them. So that's part of life history characteristics too, K versus R selection. Habitat selection is another thing. Species occur typically in certain areas where there are certain habitat conditions suitable for their survival. On land, terrestrial. In water, aquatic. Near water, in water, but not always. Like a mink that often goes and fishes in the stream, becomes on land, or a beaver, semi-aquatic. Marine, in the ocean. Freshwater, in water that's not salty. There are all kinds of different habitats. Forest, grasslands, shrublands, right? Those are the main ones there. How about behaviors? Do they live mostly on land, or are they mostly terrestrial? Do they live in the trees, though? I mean, terrestrial being ground, on the ground, arboreal being up in the trees. Scansorial, meaning that they occur on the ground a lot, but can climb up trees, like squirrels. Fossorial means they're underground most of the time, like moles. Moles are adapted for digging underground and rarely ever come up on the surface. Nocturnal, are they come out at night? Or are they daytime? For example, a flying squirrel is nocturnal. A gray squirrel is typically diurnal. And then you have animals that are most active at dawn and dusk, right at that twilight or dawn period, crepuscular. Bats are a good example of a crepuscular animal. So within a species, though, often you have selection of certain habitats that avoid competition. Let's look at three warblers. This is a common yellowthroat. Where does a common yellowthroat occur? In areas that don't have a lot of trees, like the edges of a pond with shrubs and cattails. What about a hooded warbler? Pretty similar in size, shape, and feeding, insectivorous birds. You're not going to find it on the side of a pond. You're going to find it in a forest, but only in a forest where there is light to the understory, because it's a shrub nester. This is called the hooded warbler. And then you have another bird that only occurs in very mature forest with very open understory, because this oven bird makes a nest out of leaves on the forest floor, only in mature forests. What do they eat? Well, you're probably aware that you have herbivores that feed on plants like deer, carnivores that are predators, feed on meat, and then you have omnivores that feed on a lot of things. So, a deer or a rabbit are herbivores. Carnivores would include your mountain lion and snakes that only eat other organisms. And then omnivores like bears or raccoons or possums that feed on a variety of both plant and animal matter. What about feeding behaviors? Well, you have their predators, carnivores or omnivores. Herbivory, which is called predation on plants. Foragers that just go out and look for something to eat. Okay. And these are often omnivores. They just see what they can find, not always omnivores, but often are. Parasites, which need a host that they feed off of, like a tick feeding off your blood, or a mosquito feeding off your blood, or a tapeworm feeding off of your digestive tract. And the parasites need their host to survive, and that's their only source of food. You can also have hemiparasites, though. For example, mistletoe. Getting close to that time of year for mistletoe, right? Mistletoe taps into the xylem of trees to get water. Okay, so they're parasitic on the tree that they're on, but they're also photosynthetic, so they can make their own food. So they're not totally parasitic. That's why I call them hemiparasites. And then we have homeostasis, meaning balance, how to maintain an organism's state and a state of balance. Temperature is important. That's called thermal regulation. It's part of homeostasis, an important part. Endotherms are able to generate their own body heat through metabolism of their food, which releases heat. Birds and mammals are endotherms. Typically, throughout the year, many endotherms are also homeotherms. They maintain a stable body temperature. Humans, 98.6, right? Our stable body temperature. Ectotherms are organisms that cannot generate their own body heat. They rely on the temperature around them to determine what their body temperature is. Ectotherms are often poikilotherms because the environmental temperature changes, and that means that their body temperature fluctuates. That's what a poikilotherm is. Note that these two terms here, endotherms and homotherms, are related, but not the same. And ectotherms and poikilotherms, these two terms are related, but not quite the same. For example, you can have an endotherm, our friend, the groundhog. When it's active during the year, it generates its own body heat, and it's a homeotherm, stable temperature. When it goes into hibernation, it doesn't generate as much body heat, and its body temperature can fluctuate, called a heterotherm. True hibernators, which I'm not sure groundhogs are one, but true hibernators are ones where their body temperature, like a ground squirrel, their body temperature actually is the same, almost the same as the environment around them. And then they come out of hibernation and become endotherms, generating body heat and maintaining a stable temperature. So they're homeotherms sometimes and poikilotherms others. What about behaviors to maintain homeostasis? Hibernation, it gets too cold, right? And you need to keep a little bit warmer, you go underground, like a bear or in a tree. Okay, they lower their body temperature a little bit to maintain energy when they're not feeding, because it's too cold and there's not enough to eat out there. What if it gets too hot or dry? Well, you can also go into a type of hibernation called estivation, where you wait until it's not so hot and it starts to rain again, come out. Torpor is any type of behavior where you go into a state of inactivity. And that includes hibernation and estivation. Some animals can go into a state of inactivity, torpor, and maintain their body cells from keep them from freezing by storing sugars inside the cells. Just like sugar water doesn't freeze as quickly as plain water, frogs, for example, often make a lot of sugars that they increase inside their cells, that absorb inside their cells to keep the cells from bursting, called supercooling. Some animals just don't feed as much. They're still around. They're not totally in hibernation or estivation, but they just go into a state of lower feeding and lower activity. Brumation. Your pond turtles are an example of that. They might hang out at the bottom of the pond and just chill out and not do a whole lot. Migration, that's another thing to do too. It's too cold, get out of there so you don't have to spend so much energy keeping warm. Birds do that. Half of our birds in North America that breed here in North America go to the tropics, warmer, and they don't have to spend so much energy. Migration is not just about feeding, though, too. It's about escaping predators because there's no leaves in the trees to hide the birds. And there might be more food to eat in the tropics in the winter, in the northern hemisphere winter. But there's lots of insects around in the spring, so they come back to feed on the rich supply of food that we have here in the northern hemisphere. So migration is a way to maintain a homeostasis in terms of temperature, keeping from getting eaten, and also being able to maintain energy by getting a food source. So that's our first ecology lesson. And on autecology, next up is population ecology. Nos vemos.